Thank you all for attending our Centering the Margins webinar, Human Trafficking on College Campuses, in honor of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. My name is Kinyora Parham, and I am the Executive Director of End Rape on Campus, and our mission aims to end campus sexual violence by providing direct support for survivors in their communities, prevention through education, and policy reform on the campus, local, state, and federal levels. Centering the Margins is essentially our framework under which all of our programs and initiatives focus, amplify, and support historically underserved and marginalized student survivors in the campus anti-sexual violence movement. So for today's topic, we have our presenter with us from the Blue Campaign Office of Partnership and Engagement of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, who's essentially going to go over what human trafficking on college campuses is, what it looks like, provides campus community members with best practices on recognizing and responding to indicators of human trafficking, in addition to providing a victim/survivor-centered approach practices for campus safety and law enforcement. So before I introduce our presenter, I would like to just inform you all that this webinar is being recorded. You will not have the ability essentially to share your screen, but you do have the ability to interact with one another, ask questions throughout, and at the end, if we have time, we will certainly read out your question to our presenter. And for those of you who are watching on Facebook, I would just want to apologize to you in advance that I may not always see your question, but I will do my best to ensure that your question is being asked. And if we can't get to it during the live webinar, we'll be sure to follow up with you. So with that, I also want to provide a trigger warning ahead of time, for we will be discussing content that includes sex trafficking, sexual violence, and other forms of trauma. So please feel free to step away from the screen, take care of yourself, do what you need to do. And if at any point anyone needs immediate assistance, I'm going to drop this in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to any of those hotlines. They're 24/7, they're confidential, and they're free. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenter. So Maraya Luzinski currently works at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office of Partnership and Engagement on the Blue Campaign, the department's national public awareness campaign to combat human trafficking. Specifically, Maraya supports the protection portfolio, providing outreach and engagement with federal, state, and local law enforcement, as well as with first responders. Her responsibilities include supporting and educating law enforcement through Blue Campaign's training efforts, specifically focused on promoting a victim-centered approach. Prior to the Blue Campaign, Ms. Lasinsky spent 10 years working at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, including an assignment to Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center, where she trained as an intelligence analyst. And in her free time, Maraya volunteers for 2 nonprofits in the Northern Virginia area, focusing on human trafficking awareness curriculum for elementary and middle school and victim service providers. So with that said, I'll hand it off to Maraya. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining on this Thursday evening. I really appreciate everybody signing in for this webinar. I will do my best to not bore you with PowerPoint presentations or anything like that. So just as a sort of heads up, this can be a little bit of an intense topic. So at any point, if you need to step away, or I will also make my email address available to all of you if you want to email me questions after the fact. I will leave time at the end of the presentation for today. I believe you can also chat your questions as the presentation moves forward, and then I will make sure I leave time at the end of this hour to try to address any questions that you have. And if you're on the Facebook Live or you don't get your question addressed, again, I will make sure my email is available to you. So with that said, I am going, and I don't know why I have a blue aura around me, so apologize for that, but I'm going to stop my video here in a second. And I'm going to share my screen and sort of go through some slides. And just as a heads up, I will make sure this slide deck is available to any of you that would be interested after the presentation. So anything I'm covering today, feel free to take screenshots of, but I will also make sure that everything I cover today, the entire presentation, will be available for all of you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop my video and then share my screen. And if you can you give me a heads up if you can see it, or like an all clear on your side, I'll move forward.
You're all set.
Okay, awesome. All right, so a little bit about the Blue campaign. We're at the Department of Homeland Security headquarters for the under the Office of Partnership and Engagement. As I mentioned, my name is Maraya Lasinsky. I'm one of the campaign coordinators at the Blue campaign. And again, this is my email address. You are welcome to reach out to me with questions after the fact, if I can be of any assistance to you. So I've been with the Blue campaign for a little over a year now, but I've worked in human trafficking for about 15, 16 years, whether it's in a professional setting or via volunteer work. So we are really at the Blue campaign a national public awareness campaign. So because we are under the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, I think a lot of people tend to think of us as ICE or law enforcement, and that's not really us. We are focused on public awareness. And the whole reason we were sort of set up was to educate the public, law enforcement, and other community partners, such as faith-based organizations, nonprofit organizations, industry partners, to recognize the indicators of human trafficking and then how to appropriately respond to those possible cases. So even though we at the Blue campaign are not law enforcement, we work very closely with Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI. Those are our agents who are specifically dedicated to investigating the crime of human trafficking. So we work very closely with the Department of Homeland Security with all of our other components, such as TSA, Customs and Border Protection, U.S. Marshal Service. But for us at the campaign, our point is really, to reach out to the public on that public awareness, education, and training aspect. So to start off the presentation, some of you may or may not have heard of human trafficking, but I always like to sort of give a high-level overview of what is human trafficking. So I'm not going to bore you with reading directly from these slides here, but you'll see, sex trafficking specifically, it's in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And you'll see those three terms used quite a bit when you're reading or hearing about human trafficking. But to sort of break those down a little bit, so force is obviously causing physical harm, abuse, or confinement. And we can also refer to this as a guerrilla pimp. So the term guerrilla pimp refers to a trafficker who traffics their victims by force, beating them, raping them, some sort of physical pain inflicted by them. So obviously that's sort of some examples of our definition of force. Then we also have fraud. And where fraud comes in, and we see this quite a bit, it can be false promises of love, false promises of better wages. And we call that sort of a pimp, a Romeo pimp. So a Romeo pimp sort of wines and dines his victims. They will latch on to what you're looking for, your vulnerabilities, and play on that. And then for coercion, that's serious threats of harm, physical manipulation, and that can be drugs or chemical dependency. And with coercion, it can also be against the victim's loved ones. So that if you're the victim being trafficked, they might not threaten you necessarily, but if you have a child, that trafficker will threaten your child. So that's what we refer to as coercion. And then we also talk about labor trafficking. So human trafficking, there tends to be sort of a brighter spotlight on sex trafficking, but we also have labor trafficking. And labor trafficking includes domestic servitude, which can be, it's a form of labor trafficking where a trafficker will have someone basically tied to their house. they're a maid, they're a servant, they don't get to leave. We will cover this, especially when we talk locally in the Washington, D.C. area, because we have a lot of diplomats from other countries that live in this area. And there have been cases where they've brought staff, maids over from their home country to the US and then basically keep them in bondage. And that's obviously illegal in this country. We also have cases of labor trafficking in the agriculture industry. You can see it in traveling sales crews, in restaurants, especially buffet restaurants, where you're constantly turning and burning food. There's long hours that requires a lot of manpower. So you'll see labor trafficking within the restaurant, in the food service industry, as well as in the construction industry. One thing to note for sex trafficking, for it to be considered sex trafficking, you have to show force, fraud, or coercion. There has to be proof of that. The exception to that in sex trafficking is if the victim is not yet 18 years of age. So if they are under 18, you don't have to prove any of that. So if you've ever heard the term a 16-year-old prostitute, that doesn't exist. You don't have a 16-year-old prostitute. They're a victim of sex trafficking. So that's a little bit about the two different types of trafficking that we mainly see. And what makes trafficking different from other forms of abuse is that traffickers exploit another person in exchange for something of value. And that doesn't always have to be money. When we talk about our younger victims, it can be a cell phone, it can be drugs, a PlayStation, expensive makeup, which I've seen in my volunteer work, MAC makeup specifically, if you're familiar, nice clothes, purses, it can be housing, among a number of other things. So this gives you a little bit of background on human trafficking, sex trafficking, and labor trafficking. On this slide, I want to cover a little bit about smuggling versus trafficking, because I feel like there's a lot of this in the news right now, especially what's happening at the border, and you will often hear the terms used interchangeably, and that's not the case. Smuggling and trafficking are two separate crimes. So for smuggling, this is sort of a high-level overview. So smuggling is a crime against a border. It's transportation-based. It actually requires you crossing a border. So Mexico into the United States, or or Canada into the United States. You are physically crossing a border. And smuggling is voluntary, meaning I am paying someone to knowingly smuggle me into the country illegally. Trafficking, and I think a lot of people think it means transportation-based, you can be trafficked and never leave your hometown. So trafficking is a crime against a person. It's exploitation-based. Again, no border crossing is required. You don't have to ever leave, your hometown, your city. And trafficking is involuntary. Where it can get a bit confusing is that smuggling can turn into trafficking. And a lot of times we will see this on the southern border, where we'll have a group of migrants who pay either a coyote, as someone that will walk them through the desert, or a smuggler. They will pay knowing they're coming into the US illegally, and they'll pay a certain fee. So it's $3,000 for me to get you into the United States, and you pay me your $3,000 and I smuggle you illegally into the United States. And now that I've got you here and I have you in the United States, that $3,000 just went up to $10,000. And if you don't pay me that money, I'm going to turn you over to ICE. They're going to deport you, or I'm going to threaten the family that you have back in your home country. And then that's how it turns into trafficking, because now you owe me money and you have to pay off that debt, and I'm holding something over you, right? So smuggling, trafficking, I always like to highlight this. It is two separate crimes, but in this country specifically, we will see cases where people get caught up smuggling into trafficking, and then they're terrified to go to law enforcement to help or ICE for help, because they know they entered the country illegally. They don't realize their rights. as a trafficking victim, and that they can go to law enforcement and seek help, even though they entered in illegally. So again, two separate crimes. Always like to address this, especially with what's going on right now on the border. And in keeping with that, some myths and facts about human trafficking. This is sort of, again, high level, but these are the ones we see most often. And these misconceptions perpetuate false information about human trafficking, which is really detrimental to public awareness. There's a lot of myths out there. Human trafficking, it happens all over the world, but it happens here in the United States too. Or people will say, oh yeah, well, labor trafficking happens here, but not sex trafficking. No, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, US citizens, it happens in the United States. It's a myth that victims are only foreign born or that they're poor. That is absolutely not the case. I've had victims in McLean, Virginia, which is a very wealthy part of Northern Virginia, and poverty was not an issue. A myth is that victims will attempt to seek help in public, and I'll cover some of the reasons why they don't seek help. And again, that myth that human trafficking is only sex trafficking. And we're definitely seeing an uptick of labor trafficking, but trafficking in general is a very underreported crime, very underreported. And I'll get into the reasons why, but it's why it's so hard to have accurate statistics on human trafficking. And I'll get into a little bit more of this in the presentation, but as I've mentioned, it happens here in the United States. Both meaning the United States is a place of destination where people are trafficked to the United States, but we also have US citizens who are trafficked within the United States as well. Victims can be any age, race, gender, nationality. You can't pinpoint a victim. It's a broad base. The fact is victims are often afraid to seek help because of threats from their trafficker. And I'll cover a little bit more about that. But if you think of that coercion aspect, a lot of these victims have families or children, if not here, back home in another country. And that's often the threat that they'll be harmed in some way. And again, like as I mentioned, we know labor trafficking definitely happens here, including domestic servitude. And we have seen an uptick in labor trafficking as well. So a little bit about this presentation and why I was asked to speak. So at the Blue Campaign, as I've mentioned, we're a public awareness campaign, and sort of how we focus our attention, the products that we create at the Blue Campaign is we do a gap analysis every year. And, it was mentioned, I run the law enforcement portfolio. And so I thought about, okay, who within the law enforcement community could potentially come across the victim, come across the crime, but they're not being trained on human trafficking. So at the federal level, we have lots of training, that's not really too much of a problem for us educating law enforcement at the federal level. But when you get down to your smaller state and local groups, that's where we see gaps. So in working with our Office of State and Local Law Enforcement, I was asking those questions. Hey, who is looking for training? Who's coming across human trafficking, but they don't have access to federal, resources. And that's how I got put in touch with the International Association for Campus Law Enforcement Administrators. And their acronym is called IACLEA, and they're actually located in Maryland, not too far from the DC line. And obviously we know human trafficking happens on college campuses, but they didn't really have a training curriculum on human trafficking. So at the Blue Campaign, I worked with the training director of IACLEA, campus law enforcement officers. We also worked with our Homeland Security investigation agents. We work with our victims assistance specialist. So at DHS, we have victims assistance specialists, and their sole job is to go out with our agents when they are investigating a human trafficking crime. And their purpose is to sort of stabilize that victim, get them the assistance that they need. So all that to say, a lot of rounds of interviewing go into creating a guide like this. And we always have survivors weigh in as well to make sure that everything we do at the Blue Campaign is applicable, it makes sense, and is very realistic to what's going on. So we created, it's about a 5 to 6 page guide. It's on our website. It can be downloaded and printed for free. And it's a recognition and response guide geared specifically towards campus law enforcement and public safety officials. And we also created for them a pocket indicator card. An indicator card is about the size of a credit card. And on one side of that, we have the high level indicators of what a victim of human trafficking on a college campus might exhibit. And then we also talk about a victim-centered approach. And that's something we're very proud of at the Blue Campaign. It's something we worked with our law enforcement partners on. And so on the back of this indicator card are some tips for that victim-centered approach. And I'll cover a little bit more in depth as to what that is. But these were the 2 resources we just created last year. And then coming out this fall, we're taking this recognition and response guide and creating an online training tool, because we know campus law enforcement officers obviously work different shifts. They're 24/7, located all throughout the United States. So we're taking this guide and we're currently creating an online training tool, and that will be deployed probably in the fall of this year. So a little bit more specific to get into who trafficking may affect on a college campus. So as we talked about, human trafficking victims can be any age, race, gender, or nationality. They can come from any socioeconomic group. But we know college students may be particularly vulnerable for a variety of reasons. And this is not a complete list by any means. This was a list given to us by our survivors and our law enforcement that they felt were probably the most important to put up there. So the reason why college students could be particularly vulnerable, for a lot of people, it's their first time living away from home. They might not have any friends or family nearby, so they have no social infrastructure when they go away to school. It could be economic instability and dependence. If you've ever had to pay for your college books, we all know college is not cheap. That's definitely a way that traffickers can exploit victims. There's the common use of alcohol or substances on college campuses. We know immigration status is always a way. Currently, with what's going on with the Dreamers or DACA right now, we know that can be a vulnerability that traffickers can exploit. So in addition to this list, we know students face many risk factors. And that can include things like low self-esteem. Even on college campus, we know of students being bullied. We know of students experiencing discrimination due to their race, gender identity, sexuality, disability. There could already be a family history of sexual abuse or violence, and traffickers have a really good way of sensing that about their victims. If somebody's already been through something previously in their life. Students could already have a substance abuse or addiction problem. Any sort of cognitive or physical disabilities can be exploited. And then cultural historical trauma, particularly among minority communities. So traffickers have this innate way of picking up on these vulnerabilities and sort of exploiting. How traffickers operate. So traffickers often prey, again, on individuals with few or no social support systems. And again, we know college students could be away from home for the first time, and they just want to try to fit in with their new friends, with their surroundings, making them a potential target for traffickers. And so who are these traffickers? To the victims, they can be pimps, they can be a romantic partner, they can be potential employers, community leaders, people of prominence in the community. Traffickers can also be family members. We know that the majority of people who are trafficked, it's either by a family member or a close friend. It's somebody that they know and trust. And traffickers can be friends, or they can be strangers that they just happen to meet and strike up a conversation with. So how are traffickers reaching victims on campus? And obviously, when we started working on this, this is before COVID happened and sort of everybody went into a virtual mode for learning. But we know traffickers will often go in person, but we also know they're online too. Traffickers have increasingly turned to the internet to identify and lure their victims, but they do still utilize physical meeting spaces for recruitments as well. And so again, some of the examples, this is not a full list, but these are the ones we have from our HSI agents. So some examples of how traffickers could reach their victims on college campus, popular meeting places. So like student unions, bars, off-campus parties, or anywhere else that a large number of students can congregate regularly on or near campus. We know through social media or dating apps, traffickers often use the internet to reach their victims because they can take advantage of personal information shared online to later exploit their perceived hardships or insecurities to gain trust. We know peer-to-peer recruitment happens. Obviously, campuses have a large number of young people all in one place, which can create opportunities for traffickers to coerce their victims into recruiting other peers. So victims that are made to recruit other victims are typically called bottoms, and it usually refers to a female. If you've ever heard the bottom girl or the bottom bitch or the bottom, that is a person or a victim that's been trafficked, and then they are in turn coerced almost into being a trafficker, where they pull in other people, other friends into the life. We know deceptive offers of employment, or we see this a lot in the college environment, romantic relationships. So traffickers can take advantage of any economic instability of college students, offering fake jobs. We've seen offering modeling jobs. We've seen that in a few cases, particularly when the victim's a female and they're broke or they can't pay their tuition, offering these fake jobs such as modeling, jobs that are too good to be true. And then we also see a lot of entering into these romantic relationships, the Romeo pimp scenario that we talked about, where the trafficker is providing emotional support and love in order to manipulate and lure their victim. And again, going back to that, taking advantage of financial instability. Traffickers can take advantage of students by coercing them into opening up credit cards and then running up their debt. And this was something one of my HSI agents was telling me about with a few cases that he worked on, sort of the Romeo pimp, meeting online, creating a relationship with their victim, and then having them open up credit cards, and then running up that credit card debt very quickly. And a lot of these students, it's their first credit card. They don't necessarily understand how it works. And then the trafficker has them. And then, the person now, the victim's in even more debt. And then the trafficker all of a sudden, now has ways for them to pay off that debt. And usually it results in sex trafficking. I wanted to cover a little bit about this. How are traffickers coercing victims? And this isn't necessarily just specific to college students. We see this throughout, whether it's sex trafficking victims of all ages, labor trafficking, it doesn't matter if it's male or female. And again, it goes back oftentimes to threatening the victim's family. Victims will usually take a lot of abuse, but it's when they threaten their children or the family, they'll comply. They're not going to try to get help. Threatening to expose the victim's actions to friends and family, threatening to release private photos online. And we see a lot of this with our younger victims, like high school, college, taking provocative pictures and then threatening to put them out there online. And then also reinforcing, no one's going to believe that victim if they were to seek help, isolating the victim, from friends, from family, from support networks. They can make their victims feel trapped by, this victim now has all this debt that they need to pay off, and then always claiming that law enforcement, will see them as a criminal, they're going to get into trouble, they're not going to support them. And so I mention a lot of this because human trafficking, if you've seen advertisements, there's a lot of pictures of victims being handcuffed, or they're behind bars, or they're physically trapped. And we know that that's not the majority of cases. While physical restraint can be used in trafficking situations, it's more typical that traffickers are utilizing psychological means to control their victims. So it might appear, like the victim is walking on their own. They have a cell phone. It looks like they have, free will, freedom of movement, but they're not going to seek help. They're not going to go to law enforcement because of fear that that trafficker has instilled. And it could be any number of these, if not more than just one. So these are some of the ways that traffickers can manipulate their victims with fear, with threats, and also like to mention this to try to get away from that image, victims could just run and get help they would. It's not really that simple. And so some indicators of human trafficking on campus, and this is not a full list. Again, this is going by some of our survivors who weighed in on this product and our agents who have investigated these cases. So understanding, these indicators of trafficking can help alert you to a potential victim of human trafficking on a campus, in college. And we gear this again toward our campus law enforcement officers, but I think this is just good to know if you work or you are a student on a college campus. So while no single indicator is necessarily proof of human trafficking, recognizing the signs is the first step to identifying the potential victim or the crime. So you'll see, does the student suddenly, change their behavior? Somebody who's really happy go lucky is all of a sudden very angry or crying all the time. Do they defer to another person to speak for them, especially if it's, a campus authority figure or someone in law enforcement? Does the student suddenly have more or more expensive material possessions? Like all of a sudden, your broke friend who's 19 who couldn't afford dinner the other night is carrying a Louis Vuitton bag, things like that. Do they have a dorm on campus, but you rarely see them? And other indicators can be, the student seems to be deprived of food, sleep, medical care. Did they get any new tattoos that would indicate branding by a trafficker? Or have you noticed any bruising or scars in visible places? We'll often see that on the wrists or on the forearms. Does the student appear to be coached on what to say, or do their responses seem to be rehearsed? And does the student have a difficult time providing logical answers to basic questions, such as, why did you miss class yesterday? Or why did you miss swim practice last night? Things like that. So on the social side of the indicators, does the student have a romantic partner who is quite a bit older? A new partner who's quite a bit older than them? Do they engage in unhealthy sexual behavior or indicate that they might be experiencing abuse from a partner? Are they, increasing drug use or alcohol use? Are they not keeping in touch with friends or family or their social networks? Do they have a large financial debt that they are unable to pay off? Or do they not seem to be in control of their own money? And again, it's this lack of control that the student or the victim could potentially, show. Does the person make references to frequent travel to other cities or towns? Do they live with an employer or have their employer listed as their caregiver or emergency contact? Do they lack, control over their own personal schedule? Are they suddenly missing these classes or practices? Do they lack control over their ID or passport or other documents? So again, not a complete list, but these are some of the higher level ones that we've seen in trafficking cases on campus. So I mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation, talking about a victim-centered approach. So as I work on the law enforcement portfolio, as I've mentioned, I am not law enforcement. It's not my job to investigate the crime, tell police how to investigate the crime, how to collect evidence. But what we do work on at the Blue Campaign is teaching this victim-centered approach to all law enforcement. And again, we worked with our HSI agents and our victims assistance specialists and survivors on this approach. And basically what a victim-centered approach means is that law enforcement should conduct, various investigative approaches that do not solely focus on the victim being the key witness, that they put as much emphasis on that victim, getting them stabilized, getting them, any services that they need, placing just as much emphasis on that victim that they do on prosecuting and investigating that crime. Because what we've seen in the past is that victims can be re-traumatized right there on the scene. Law enforcement hasn't always been educated on how potential victims can react and respond, the trauma that they've been through. And so law enforcement is trying to investigate, right, and prosecute and get the trafficker, but the victim isn't willing because they're not trusting law enforcement. Law enforcement could be accusatory, towards them, or referring, to them as a prostitute or things like that. So we very much focus on a victim-centered approach, which is always putting the victim needs first. And that's regardless of whether they choose to participate in the prosecution of the case or not. Because what we do know is if you don't have a willing victim, like a cooperating victim, you're not going to be able to successfully prosecute that case anyhow. And so this goes into a little bit more of when our audience is, again, campus law enforcement or public safety officials. This is some guidance from that guide about what they should do when encountering a potential human trafficking victim. We always want to reemphasize that the victim might not be comfortable working with law enforcement. And you've seen a number of reasons why already. Usually law enforcement has been used as a threat against them, so they fear law enforcement. A lot of victims don't identify as a victim, and we see this quite a bit in sex trafficking. So we talked about the Romeo pimp, right? And the Romeo pimp is whining and dining you, and that's if you're a female victim, oftentimes it's a male trafficker, and that's your boyfriend. That's not your pimp. That's not your trafficker. That's your boyfriend. That could be the only person that ever said, I love you in your entire life. So sex trafficking victims will often not identify as the victim. And I once had an FBI agent tell me that, when gangs started running women instead of drugs and guns, it got much harder to prosecute the cases, because he said you could get other gang members to turn on each other, but if you had a female victim, she would never turn on her trafficker. And those cases became much harder to prosecute. Victims may not be able to tell a whole story or a complete story. The victim can identify with their trafficker, or again, express romantic feelings. And that goes back to that Romeo pimp scenario. Or they fear judgment from those in authority. So to switch gears a little bit, because I know the basis for this presentation was for college students, campus, potentially administrators. But one thing I wanted to bring up for everyone's awareness is a new guide that we created. It was very similar to me running the law enforcement portfolio and finding gaps. My coworker who works with vulnerable populations was doing the same thing. Who are the vulnerable populations at risk for being trafficked, and how do we get to them first, right? Being preventative. And so through rounds and rounds of feedback with subject matter experts and survivors, we created a how to talk to youth about human trafficking. And this is a guide for youth caretakers and individuals working with youth. So we knew that teachers, there was quite a few resources out there for teachers, for parents, but not necessarily other adults who work with youth, like mentors or camp counselors or working at a boys and girls club, things like that. So it was a way to get that conversation started for adults who work with youth, because we know youth in general is a vulnerable population. And so the guide goes into, like you'll see here, again, how traffickers operate and reach potential victims. And this is going into youth. So we're talking, more of your elementary, middle, junior high, under age of 18 for this guide. The myths and realities of trafficking, why youth are vulnerable, the indicators. So a little bit about what I covered with you with trafficking on a college campus. This guide speaks to youth. So if any of you on this presentation are administrators, or you work with youth, or you volunteer, or anything like that, we have this guide available on our website. and it's again for free. But this is a preventative measure. So this is us trying to get to vulnerable populations before they're exploited. And for those of you on the call this evening, as I mentioned, Blue Campaign, we're all about public awareness. So we have a range of different toolkits for our different partners and sectors. And so we have a toolkit for students in case any of you college students who are interested in raising awareness within your community on your college campus. We have a free toolkit. It's on our website. And it includes tips for recognizing human trafficking on your campus. We offer free posters that can be hung in your dorms and public areas or around your campus. Ideas for awareness events. Again, we go over those indicators of trafficking, and then we specifically talk about those traffickers' recruitment tactics, specifically in public places. And one thing I want to note too, I have this on a separate slide, but for those of you who might be interested in sort of having your own campaign or in raising awareness, or you're looking to get involved, I'll talk a little bit more about an NGO called Polaris. And I have their information on another slide where you can research NGOs within your own town, your own city. It seems like there's a number of you from different locations across the US on how you can get involved in your own communities too. But again, this toolkit, it's on our website. You're welcome to ping me for it, but it's on our website. It's for free. You can download it, you can print it out, but just as a way if you're interested in getting involved. And on this next slide, again, this is just to sort of go over it, the Blue Campaign. This is a very small sampling of what we do. We have multiple poster series, indicator cards, cue cards, pamphlets, and everything is free on our website. On this website up here, if you were to go to it, you'll also see you can do a bulk order. So let's say you wanted 50 indicator cards, or you wanted 20 campus law enforcement guides. We have an order form on our website that you can fill out and submit. And so we ship for free across the United States, all of our materials. I think we're actually caught up now after COVID. We had quite a delay in shipping in the last year, but all of our materials, I really, really recommend, if this is something you want to learn more about, get involved in, I highly recommend going to our library. As I've mentioned, everything we do with the Blue Campaign, we go through rounds and rounds of review with subject matter experts, and survivors always weigh in and improve everything we do. So we always loop survivors in at the very beginning of creating a product. So I highly recommend you going to our website. Everything is free to use. The last sort of thing I want to leave you with is how to report. So, at this first bullet, you'll see, and again, this is sort of geared towards if you were my campus law enforcement officers, at DHS, we don't ever want to override your own protocol. So if your campus, your college, if your department, whoever you work for has your own human trafficking protocol, please by all means follow that. But what we can offer at the Blue Campaign is supplemental support. So that first number, the 866 number up there, that is to reach Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI. That's our tip line. So if you call that number, and there's also a web form you can fill out too online, you are getting in touch with law enforcement. Just be aware of that. You are getting in touch with law enforcement. Every tip that is reported to this number has to be investigated. Now, you can call that anonymously, and there's no repercussions. If you happen to report what you think is a human trafficking case and it's found out to not be, there's no repercussion or consequence, for you calling to report. We always say it's much better to report than not. Now, in addition to that HSI tip line, we also, on all of our Blue Campaign materials, we have both numbers listed. That second number, the 1888 number, that is the National Human Trafficking Hotline number. And that's run by an NGO called Polaris that's local to Washington, D.C. Now, if you call this number, again, you can call anonymously. They also provide victim services. So if somebody doesn't want to call law enforcement, or they don't necessarily want law enforcement involved, you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. to report the case. They can get law enforcement involved, but they can also offer victim services like an emergency shelter. And the third thing I wanted to mention on this slide, sort of going back to if you want to get involved in your community or volunteer, if you go on the National Human Trafficking Hotline website, which I've listed up here, they have a referral directory. And what that does is it breaks down, you would click on your state where you're located, and they have vetted all the NGOs who work in the human trafficking sector. So I really recommend, checking out that directory if this is something you would like to get involved with, something that's a little bit more closer to home or where you live. I think Polaris does an amazing job. You can also learn by going on this website a little bit more about your home state and what trafficking is looking like in your own state. So again, that's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. It's run by NGO Polaris. And all federal law enforcement actually work really closely with them. And we do a lot of really good information sharing, on where we're seeing cases that are upticking, because again, human trafficking, always hard to get statistics, it's very, very underreported, but they do have a lot of great call data. And so if you do want to follow us, if you want to contact us, here's all of our information. For being the government, we're pretty lucky that we get to have our Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and everything like that. But these are the different ways, you can get in touch with us. But again, everything, I always like to highlight this, everything on our website is free for you. So please take advantage of our resources. We also have training videos. They might be 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And we also offer a lot of our resources in 26 different languages. So all of our resources and videos are in Spanish online. And then you can also, again, fill out that order form. And like I said, for most of our products, not all, they come in 26 different languages. So with that, let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And I'll put myself back on video. And I don't know if there's any questions. Like I said, I will make sure the slide deck is available to you all. But you have my email address in that slide deck. So if I can answer anything for you, now or after the fact. But thank you all for listening and participating.
Thank you so much, Maraya. That was definitely an informative presentation, and I really truly hope that each and every one of you who are, attending at this presentation and watching has definitely learned a thing or two. I certainly have, especially the difference between smuggling and trafficking. I think a lot of people use those interchangeably a lot, and so it was good to have that breakdown. And thank you again for also breaking down and demystifying the myths that exist, and really going into what's actual reality around human trafficking, especially on college campuses. So if there are any questions, definitely want to, there is a question.
Okay.
And it says, Mississippi is a center for trafficking because it is a coast plus north/south and east-west major highways. Do you have any experience with trafficking on college campuses in Mississippi?
So Mississippi specifically, I can't give you any case data, but what I would recommend, because I work very closely with a councilman in Alabama who has had similar experiences, what I would recommend if you want more specific data for Mississippi is go on Polaris, Polaris, go on the Polaris website and go to it will have a state report card for you. And it may give you a little bit more, I don't have a case off the top of my head for a university in Mississippi, but I understand where you're coming from with the highways and the intersection. And I know from my experience in Alabama, very similar to Mississippi, but I want to give you accurate state specific information. So I would go on Polaris website. And again, you could also go on that National Human Trafficking Hotline website. And you would be able to pull more specific information for Mississippi specific. I also recommend sorry, really quickly, go on the Mississippi Attorney General's website. Go on your state. It's your state's website for your Attorney General. You can also feel free to email me and I will get you the information, and your Attorney General would also have specific information on trafficking within your state.
And they're actually asking you to talk a little bit more about what you have done in Alabama, and if you could share a little bit of that.
Yeah. So I hate to say that COVID threw a wrench in it. So before COVID happened, it's called the World Games, which I had never heard of. Like different sports that aren't in the Olympics, there's like a separate competitive group for that. And Birmingham, Alabama was hosting the World Games, and I was brought in to start consulting on I'm sure you're all aware of this, like anytime you have a big event like the Super Bowl or whatnot, you always hear about human trafficking, right? And they sort of wanted to get ahead of it. And obviously the World Games got postponed. I don't have a new date for it. So I didn't ultimately end up getting to go to Alabama for it when it does get rescheduled. But Alabama is currently working on, they're aware of sex trafficking, but they have a major labor trafficking problem, and they don't have the education and the resources in place yet. So I'm still working. It's getting to go there in person. Unfortunately, my trip got canceled, but more to come on that, because Alabama is seeing, again, labor trafficking, and they just don't have the resources. So that's what Blue Campaign is helping to educate, like the hotel sectors down there, the restaurant sectors, things like that, on how trafficking plays a part.
The next question is, why do big events like World Games attract traffickers? And even the Super Bowl too, I know, is another big event as well.
It's groups of men. Men tend to be the largest buyers. So wherever you have large groups of men gathering, NASCAR events is another one. The Super Bowl gets the most press, but we've also seen some pretty horrific cases at NASCAR events. Anytime you have really these large event gatherings where your audience, we know, men still make up the largest buyers of sex. That's where traffickers go. Like, that's where they're going to push the girls. Wherever you have, there's a demand there for it.
And would you say that there's like an increase or decrease, maybe a similar kind of statistics, whether it's a professional like NFL game, Super Bowl game, versus like a college level game that may be happening?
We've seen it, the statistics that we do have, we see it a little bit more at that professional level. When you get into colleges, you get into like more of an issue with potential minors being involved in the audience and things like that. Not to say that it doesn't happen, but they also want money, right? Like, who's in your audience is going to be able to pay for this. So that's why it tends to be more at these professional higher levels, because those are your money makers, and those are the people that are attending these events that are going to pay the big money for the girls.
Wow. It's such a scary thing. And sometimes you don't even recognize like how, like, what is supposed to be a fun event, maybe a family fun event, turns into something horrific for another family. So I definitely want to thank you so much, Maraya, for your presentation on this, and definitely providing with us more insight on human trafficking, and not just on college campuses, but beyond that. We do have one other question that has come in, and that is, do traffickers also recruit victims at big sports events? Oh yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, they can. Absolutely. Absolutely. Recruiting other victims. It'll usually be, again, that peer-to-peer, like a trafficker is going to get a person and then turn your friend or somebody, like we talked about the bottom as well, and pull you into that. But yeah, you can have traffickers recruit absolutely at these events. They have a really great innate sense to seek out the people, who are vulnerable, who've had abuse in the past, things like that. So yeah, absolutely.
We may have time for one or two more questions if there's any others that want to jump in. Give a couple of seconds.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Maria, again, for just the opportunity and your time in providing this breakdown. This has definitely been informative. And as Maria had mentioned earlier, we will be able to make her presentation available. I will make sure that we send this to you in a follow-up email. So you'll see also the video as well as the presentation deck that you can utilize. I will definitely encourage all of you to please go to the websites that she has provided and, look up, any of the resources and toolkits that you would need. And, try to figure out how you can implement some awareness campaigns on your campus, or as well as, how to speak with students if you're a campus administrator. And if you're looking for any other resources from NWIP on campus, please don't hesitate to go to our website as well and connect with us for more information. So with that, Maria, I want to say thank you again. And just thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a blessed and wonderful evening. Take
Thank
care,
you very
everyone.
much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.